Women are not secondary players in human destiny, and society has always known that.
Unless we get this structural reform, we're always going to have torment of powerlessness.
Equality means that some of those ill-gotten gains must be given up.
Consciousness is an intellectual illusion.
Hello everyone, welcome to the UNSW Centre for Ideas for tonight's event, Justice and Love. And we are celebrating tonight the launch of a very significant book called Justice and Love by our two speakers, Dr. Mary Zounazi and Dr. Rowan Williams. Now, throughout this event, we will have a live audience with our speakers and a live Q&A. So thank you to those of you who have already submitted a question. Also, throughout this discussion, you can comment on Facebook, and that means you can also use the live chat on YouTube or post on Twitter, yes, Twitter, using the hashtag UNSW Ideas. My name's Andrew West. I'm the presenter of the Religion and Ethics Report on Radio National at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Before we start, I would like to extend a welcome and acknowledge the Bidjigal people. They are the traditional owners of this land, and we pay our respects to their elders of yesterday, today, and indeed tomorrow. And we also extend our respect to any of our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are joining us for tonight's event. Our speakers tonight are the authors of this book. Dr. Mary Zounazi, she's an Australian cultural philosopher. Mary is the multi-award-winning documentary maker. Her most famous documentary, Dogs of Democracy, was screened worldwide. Her most recent documentary is Rembitika Blues. She's also the author of many books, the most notable Hope, New Philosophies for Change and Inventing Peace, which she co-authored with the German filmmaker Wim Wenders. Mary also teaches at UNSW in the School of Social Sciences. And Dr. Rowan Williams, he is the former master of Magdalen College at Cambridge University in the UK. Rowan was most notably the Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 to 2012. He's the author of many, many books. Two of my favourites are on Augustine and also Faith in the Public Square. Mary, welcome. Rowan, as much as I am an Anglophile, I'd love to refer to you by your formal title, which is Baron Williams of Oystermouth, because you do sit in the House of Lords. This is Australia, and I know you're not someone who stands on ceremony. Welcome, Rowan.
Thank you very much.
Let's start, Mary, by asking you, how did this conversation, which you've now turned into a book, come about?
I was, or have been, and always have been a great admirer of Rowan's work. And in particular, I came across his book, Christ on Trial, which I found a really important book at a particular moment in my life. It was really trying to work through questions of, I guess, forgiveness, how to think through tragedy. But one of the most interesting things about Rowan is his imagination and the role of creativity in thinking about, important kind of issues. And so I had been thinking about questions of hope, as you had noted, questions of peace, and then I had moved into thinking about justice, which came from both a kind of personal and political concern. And I contacted Rowan and asked him whether he would be interested in working on this idea, and he agreed.
Rowan, this book has a lovely, almost accidental quality about it. How did it come about from your end?
Well, I had a communication from Mary suggesting we might perhaps get together and simply converse about some of these issues. And because I share with Mary this very strong sense that the imagination has a role to play in our moral thinking, I was very glad to pursue this. I've been doing a bit of work on concepts of human rights here and there. I've been thinking through some of the ethical questions around how we define empathy, and writing some lectures on that. So really this came very timely, and it was a real stimulus to think harder. The conversations that are recorded here took place in a variety of settings, including some rather noisy cafes where it wasn't easy to record, but they represent not just the two of us thinking about ideas, but also the two of us trying to respond to the unfolding world around us at a time of colossal change and crisis.
I love the idea, though, that you formulated these ideas in coffee houses. All the best ideas come out of coffee houses going back to the 17th century London.
Well, it was, they were accidental in that way, but I just wanted to follow up what Rowan was saying, because it really was, we started these conversations with an idea in mind to explore justice, rights, how the imagination plays in that, and then world events kept kind of happening as we were working, and so we would be constantly having to deal with what's going on, Syria, Brexit, all these things, and so it became actually quite a concrete reflection on the themes and ideas that we were talking about, have been talking about.
I want to ask you, and this is a bit unusual, how do you both disagree? It's not the usual starting point. Rowan is a world-renowned theologian, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, no less. Mary, I believe you are perhaps best described as a lapsed Greek Orthodox. So
yes.
how do you both disagree? Because that's in a way, it's an unusual but good starting point.
Rowan, did you want to talk, or I'm happy to?
How did we start, Mary, as a lapsed Greek Orthodox?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think for me, maybe to answer the question slightly differently, is it's about thinking about secular worlds, how secular ideas can kind of come to and meet theological ideas, and ways in which these two, which maybe rub against each other, actually have a potential to help us think about ways of living, ways of addressing crisis. So I guess the point of disagreement really isn't a point of disagreement, it's actually a way of trying to reconcile different worlds in a way, and recognising that historically, this is a moment where perhaps these things could be brought forward, recognising all the dangers, of course, in all of that, but just that there's got to be a space for that discussion.
Yes, I don't think we ever began with the idea of what we agree about and what we disagree about. We recognised from the start that we're coming from different places. That I occupy, obviously, a place within a Christian tradition, Christian community, with responsibilities that go with that, as a priest and a bishop. My world is shaped by those convictions, and that's not necessarily the world that other people will stand in and begin from. But if I'm serious about what I believe, then I believe it's something that can be thought with, that can enrich and energize conversation with whoever. So that's why I'm always grateful for the opportunity to explore with people who do come from a different set of assumptions, and just see where we get, see how much of a common world we can construct as we speak together. And
Rowan, I noticed that Ben Okri, the poet who wrote the preface, says that Rowan wears his faith lightly, not defensively. An archbishop who wears his faith lightly. What do you think he means by that?
Well, I can imagine that some of my co-religionists might take that. I mean, I don't take it seriously. But it does seem to me that faith is, among other things, the opposite of anxiety. So if you try to live faithfully, you try to live without being anxious, without defensiveness. If it's real, it's deep. If it's deep, it doesn't constantly need to be dug up and fussed over and protected. You trust what faith is about to sustain you, to give you perspective, enlightenment, courage, and all the rest of it. And get on with the conversation and don't worry, I suppose, is what I hope to say. And to say it's worn lightly doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worn habitually with conviction.
Mary, I guess it's in a way not surprising, though, that you and Rowan would have this conversation. I notice that you like to quote the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. What did Charles Taylor, just remind us, say about the origins of values or practices that we think of as secular?
Well, yeah, I mean, his point, I suppose, is that these have a historical origin. The move or the words or the ideas change historically, and perhaps where we are now with certain uses of words, they do have this meaning that resonates. And I guess part of our conversation or part of our exploration has been trying to put meaning back into those words for our own personal sense, I guess, for how we experience the world ourselves uniquely, but how those words like love, being the obvious one, but things like compassion, things like charity, things that have kind of been well worn, I guess, but have lost a real vigour and appeal. Like, how do we bring those things together so that they're not shied away from in discussion, in people's lives, in political debate? And I think we could probably say there's a real vacuum of those kind of deeper senses of meaning in political debate. I'm not saying that everything is like that, but the need to sort of, in fact, enact the practice of taking care and so on and so forth, I think are things that theology and secularism could come together more profoundly. Yeah.
But Rowan, I'm reading...
One of the things,
yes, I'm sorry.
just to add to that, one of the things that Charles Taylor really focuses on is what's happened to our concept of the self in the modern centuries. And if you like, the exposure of the modern self, we're left, as it were, to make it all up from our own bowels, as if we have to make meanings as individuals without resource, without nourishment, without guidance from community relations. And whatever else is true of religious discourse, it says yourself is always plugged into networks, resources, streams of life and meaning, which you don't fully grasp, but you have to let yourself be shaped by that, not just to think it all depends on you. I think what Mary is talking about is how we keep alive and revivify that sense of belonging within something that's not just about our preferences, our feelings at any one instant, to fill out the world and let it be more three-dimensional, and fill out the self too.
Now, the book, my well-notated copy here, is titled Justice and Love. These terms might seem blindingly obvious, but I think you actually have a discussion about what they mean. And you both have a very nuanced view about what justice means. We'll deal first of all with justice. Rowan, how do you define justice? Because it's not simply the scales of justice. It's not simply the legal notions, is it?
Very much not. I start really from the position that to think of justice primarily as making sure everybody gets what they deserve is a very thin picture of justice. But when you look at the way in which it's used in classical philosophy, in the Bible, in other contexts, what you see, and what the very words suggest in Hebrew and in Greek, is justice as a sense of being aligned with something, being in tune with something. A just life, well, it's expressed in the phrase we still use about doing justice. Does that performance do justice to the musical work? Is it really in tune with what's going on? And that sense of justice as attunement, alignment, being in harmony with what is there, and thus being in harmony with other people, so that you do indeed react to them in an appropriate and just way. I think unless you have that deep background, your notion of justice will be a very diminished one. I guess that's what I most wanted to push in thinking through justice in this stuff.
And what do you say is the problem, Rowan, with an outlook that says that justice is just about getting things settled? I don't mean necessarily getting them settled and out of the way, but what is the problem with the idea of reaching a final settlement in justice?
There's something to be said for the idea of settlement, simply because you need often agreement on the basis on which you proceed to act and go forward. But the notion of settlement might suggest there's a bundle of requirements, entitlements and so forth, which have to be met before you can move forward, that everyone comes into the world with a bundle of entitlements. And that's not, in my mind, the most important thing about talking of, say, human rights. I think there's something deeper and more demanding. And there has to be somewhere in this a sense that we will never completely do justice to one another. We're always struggling to attune ourselves in understanding and learning in our relation with others, so that there's a dynamic, a creative quality of justice. To talk too much about settlement might diminish that.
Yeah, I guess one of the things for me was trying to think about when it fails, and often it fails for people because it's settled and maybe it really wasn't settled. The issues, the grief, the sorrow, and I think, one of the things about trying to open up the meaning of justice is to think about that suffering, that grief, the sorrow, and how do you kind of address that real sense of grief, which I think, underpinning a lot of people's displacement, a lot of people's anger, is a grief, is some fundamental grief that's not addressed. And I think you need to complicate justice in that way. So of course, you need the legal world, of course, but you also need to have an openness towards trying to explore possibilities of how do you deal with somebody else's suffering. And I think Simone Weil, it's a philosopher that both Rowan and I do really like. I think she offers some interesting ways to think about the harm, the cry, how do you address that? How do you actually address somebody else's suffering without diminishing it?
Mary, you also come up with this idea that justice involves the right to refuse, which I found a fascinating concept. Flesh that out. What do you mean, the right to refuse? Yeah,
I think it's borrowed actually from Simone Weil, who writes about the power to refuse. And what she's saying is that if you are in a culture, wherever that be, and you don't have the power to actually say no to something, then that is actually saying something about the social order in which you're existing. So if you can't say no to being exploited, then there is something that has to be addressed in the social order to the reason why you don't have that power to refuse, that power to say no to an injustice. I think to have the power to say no to something is a position that very few people really have. And I think it's something that she's presenting, and it's something I think that's really important to think about, that if you are in a situation where you can't say no to it and you're being forced to continually be exploited, then that's taking away your power. That's taking away your agency. Does that help? I hope that helps.
No, it helps a lot. It raises for me this other question too, that I'd be interested in Rowan's perspective on, and that is the question of justice as administered by those in authority. Now, is every law that is promulgated, if you like, by a justly or properly constituted government, that is a democracy, is that required in a moral sense to be followed, as opposed to laws that may be promulgated by a dictatorship or even worse, a totalitarian government?
That touches, doesn't it, on the distinction between what's lawful and what's right. I think that something is lawful doesn't necessarily mean that it is morally right, or good, or to be pursued in itself. But it tells us there is a broad moral agreement about this subject in the society, which it is reasonable to go along with. So ordinary, what you might call routine lawkeeping is certainly a moral matter. It doesn't in itself tell you what the good to be pursued is. And this is something we often get a bit muddled about. We think that perhaps when we've settled a legal question, we've settled a moral question. And that's not necessarily the case. or we want, because we feel strongly morally about something, we want it legally enshrined. And I have some worries about it. I like the idea that a good society keeps on having moral arguments, even when it comes to settling certain questions. To take the obvious example, lots of religious communities continue to have real moral difficulties about abortion, the conditions on which that ought to be legal. Many communities want to enshrine their position in law. The legal position is this is permissible. So I don't think that a religious community ought to be struggling to enforce its position in law, but I think the argument can still be had. The moral argument can still be had. So it's a complex area, but I just want to pick up also what Mary was saying about the right to refuse. Because what we're talking about there is justice as involving a recognition that the other has a voice, and that what you owe to them is not just a set of debts, but you owe them their freedom. You owe them their freedom to speak. If you are getting in the way of that freedom to act and contribute to society, then that is an unjust situation. You try to release a voice into action, into engagement, into argument.
You both quote in the book, you like the great 20th century theologian and indeed martyr, Reinhold Niebuhr. Rowan, just remind me, his statue is atop the 20th century martyrs at Westminster Abbey, not Reinhold Niebuhr, as great as he was, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You both invoke Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I mean, Bonhoeffer was someone who very definitely spoke about the right to refuse, and that was that you needed to put a spoke in the wheel of power.
Well, I think Rowan's probably more the Bonhoeffer kind of expert here, I'd say. Did you want to talk about that spoke?
Not an expert, but an enthusiast. And part of what I find so deeply fascinating about Bonhoeffer is precisely that he addresses some of these questions about what do we owe to government. And he's not quite a strong sense that good government does properly require our loyalty, our commitment, but that it deals with what he calls the penalty, not the ultimate. When government tries to settle ultimate questions of human identity and human meaning in a way which also excludes other human beings, then you've got a problem. You've got a call to resistance. So if you have a government that seeks to make loyalty to itself the one test of citizenship, if you have a government that systematically dehumanizes other groups, especially the Jews in Germany, then that government has lost its claim to be just. The paradox is that really good government is government that knows its limitations.
We've been talking theoretically. In the second half of this discussion, we're going to talk in very concrete terms. But rather than aggregate all the questions from the audience to the end, I'm going to ask some now to kind of break this up. We have a question from, we have a very important, very basic question, powerful in its simplicity, from Monique Dam. What is the role of compassion? I'll start with you, Mary.
Yeah, it's a great question.
As I say, powerful in its simplicity.
Yeah. I mean, I think to sort of come to it in a roundabout way is, I think, the issue of love that we've been discussing and grappling with and thinking through, an element of that is compassion. The ability to, I guess, feel and understand another. But I think love itself, in which compassion also sits, I think is a bigger term. And I have to say, I was listening, just recently I've been re-listening to David Bowie and Queen and Under Pressure. And there's a wonderful line that they say to the extent that, that love dares you. Love's a dare. And I think if you think about it in that kind of really interesting way, it's not anything boring or weak or insensitive. Compassion is strong and powerful and in fact has a real strength that we haven't even tapped into yet, because we almost feel like it's just something that's, but it actually has a real force and a real dare. And I think also creatively, if you think of the best art, the best stories, there is always that dare. And I think love and compassion bring us that, in a sense.
Rowan?
It takes us right back to where we started, I think, with the role of the imagination. Compassion is the strongest exercise of imagination that we could think of, because it's a real attention to an absorption of another person's position, another person's, I won't say just taking on all their emotions, but a real sense of what it is like to be there. And to see the world from a perspective that is not dictated by my preferences, my comfort, my concerns, my fears. So compassion, in that sense, is a freedom, which is why it is indeed a central strand in love. It's a freedom to be there with and for another, and represents not a kind of flabby, oh, I know, response to somebody else's suffering, but a real commitment to solidarity, presence, faithfulness.
And can I just follow that?
Please.
Can I follow that, Rowan? Because one of the things that struck me in conversation with Rowan, because it was just a gift to be able to discuss these ideas, with you, is you had a line which I love very much about the need to train the imagination, and I think in that sense too, we need training. We need to learn what compassion is. It's not just like all of a sudden you have it. It's something about it being an art in itself of learning or of unlearning cultural habits. And that's where I think, education, all these things become really vital, because public discourse, public discussion in how to train the imagination.
Let's stick with Rowan and a question from Anne Clifford. If we are called, and this is, I think, particularly apposite for Rowan, if we are called to love those who do not love us, does justice provide a framework for how far we should go in our love?
That's a very good question, and a very, very searching one. So, let's see. If we're called to, let's put it this way, to be faithful to one another, to stay with one another, that's, I would say, the basis of a really moral community. The recognition that the other person is not going to go away, and that I have to come to terms with them. That doesn't mean I don't challenge them. And it doesn't mean that I don't say to the other person, I don't think you're seeing clearly. We argue, and I think this is, as I hinted before, this is an important part of what a working society really looks like. We have the freedom to argue without panic and without violence. But it's hard work. We would all like a conclusion to come quickly where somebody else says, that's it, I'm perfectly to be the same. And that won't happen in a hurry, which is why I say we need faithfulness. We need to recognize that the other's not going away, that I need to hold my ground and keep on with that loving, attentive, but also truthful and integrity-oriented presence with them. So justice helps here, I think, as an idea, simply in saying, I need to try and see and hear the other person without the distortion of my own fears or my own worries. I need to try with the other to find a way of seeing the world around that's consistent and sustainable. That's all bound up in the idea of justice. And we work at that together as best we can. And of course, there are circumstances where that breaks down and can't go forward. I'm not saying that this is a magic bullet, but I think that's the method.
Anne's question is a very good segue into the next section of our discussion. I want to now talk in concrete terms. We've been talking in very philosophical terms about justice and love. I want to ask you both now about the ways in which the last 7 or 8 years since you began this conversation, which I think began in 2014, 2015, I want to ask you about the ways in which love and justice have been tested by current events, ongoing events that convulse the world. Mary, terrorism, surely the most significant test of the concepts of love and justice.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a way to think about that, as well as to think about the effects of it, because Can I talk about Syria for a moment?
You most certainly can.
Because
talk about Syria.
I think one of the things that really did emerge when we were having our discussions was Syria, and I think one of the most devastating things, I think, is the civil war there, which I think is a result of a lot of historical issues, but the effects are on everyday people, and how do you respond to that? How can you respond to that? And I think there is something really significant about, and I think Rowan talks about this a little bit too in our discussions, but just the basic kind of humanity of welcoming somebody, of recognising them in some particular kind of way, recognising the context in which people who are perhaps drawn to a certain violence are coming from as well. So that it's not just, it's the role also of understanding the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time, trying to understand what is driving certain kinds of violence. And I think, Rowan, you said something too really that I like very much, that there's nothing automatic about violence. There's nothing automatic about it. It doesn't have to always happen, And so I think one of the challenges for us, and I think in real terms, in general, is how do you address the other, the person in front of you, who is suffering the effects of bombs, war, whatever it might be, and that could be the person who's actually throwing the bomb as well. So it's kind of, I guess, it's in no way excusing acts of violence, but it's trying to find ways to understand, I guess, the destitution of people and others.
Syria was the classic wicked problem, though. I know that Rowan's, through Christian Aid, has paid a lot of attention to the crisis in Syria. It was the classic wicked problem in this sense, that it was or is a country held together in a very fragile way, balancing a whole lot of different religious confessions, the fear that religious minorities had of being not simply oppressed but even eliminated by an angry, resentful, long-suppressed religious majority. I mean, that was a classic example, wasn't it, Rowan, of really justice that was... We were searching for a kind of justice there that was almost impossible to clarify, if you get my point.
Yes, I do. And I think what I was hearing quite often from people in the region was people trying to solve our problems from outside without attending, once again, to the complexity of communal relations on the ground, are consistently making it worse. Now, we've had, I think, decades of this attempt to impose various kinds of grids of settlement and pacification in the region, most of which have not arisen out of any real sense of how those communities work together or could work together. And that's the tangle we're currently in. I just don't myself think that piling on the pressure, military and otherwise, on the region actually makes it less of a pressure cooker, because by definition we're not liberating, we're not releasing it. Now that's not to say, obviously echoing Mary, not to say that there's any weakening of the condemnation of violent action indiscriminate terror and murder. Clearly, these need to be resisted, these need to be avoided, and sometimes, yes, force is needed for that. But we have indiscriminately, I think, reached for solutions imposed from outside. So, yes, hideously complex problem. And as Mary says, we need all the time to go back to the question, well, what is it that makes terrorism look like an appealing option to people? What is it that makes it credible? And that requires a big leap of imagination. It's not to collude, it's not to condone, it's simply to say, we need to understand where this comes from. Only then do we have a chance of knowing how we creatively respond.
Mary, you can answer your own question for me here, the one that you pose in the book, where you say, what are the implications, because it's a perfect example, Syria, what are the implications of selfishly oriented or ruthless decisions on people? What did Syria tell us about that issue?
It told us that I think we need to really address that kind of ruthlessness, because I mean, bearing in mind the complexity, and I guess also, can I just say, having just been to the Middle East and particularly Egypt, I was looking at a historical structure of a country which has been colonised over and over again. And the effects of colonisation, also colonialism on countries, it's like they're way back, these histories. And also, until we take some responsibility, not to say that we are condemned to, our own, that we blame ourselves for what happened in the past, but we are responsible to it. And I think Emmanuel Levinas has a wonderful line about, and he borrows from Dostoevsky, that we are responsible for people that came before us, and we have to deal with that responsibility now. So in other words, even though we may not have caused the violence directly, we have to in some way embrace it and try to address it. And that's not easy. I mean, there's anger always on every side. Why should I help somebody, or why should they give me gifts, or whatever it might be. And I think there's something in that recognition. And also when you see people, I was in Lesbos where the Syrians were arriving at the time, and you see these boats and you see the debris, and you realise that there's like a snow white backpack, and you realise that whole family is just drowned. And that snow white, you think, oh, they don't, you don't realise that commonality, that kind of sharedness of that humanness that we have. But it's not only human. I think Rowan and I were also talking about, non-human, sentiency. The whole thing about trying to understand our responsibility to a certain degree is that realm of justice and love. It's a long way of answering that question.
But broadening it now to the broader question of terrorism, political violence, Rowan, you have this wonderful quote where you talk about the different ways in which people are characterised. They're characterised diabolically, which I assume also, relates to, Diablo, the devil. They're characterised diabolically, they're characterised humanly, or they're characterised angelically. Tell us about that concept and how it relates to political violence, because someone's Diablo is another person's saint, really, isn't it?
Yes, the origin of the quote is in a remark made by a Christian teacher of the late 4th, early 5th century, where he talks about the 3 different ways in which we can look at the world, with an ordinary human knowledge, which, as it were, just registers what's there, with a diabolical knowledge, which tries to turn everything into raw material for my needs and my priorities, and the angelic knowledge, which sees things as they're turned towards God, which sees things in their true dimension. So it's really about my attitude and responses to the world. Do I see the world in terms of my agenda, or do I look at the world as turned away from me towards something deeper? And that sense of looking at the world, including other people, but also importantly, including the natural order, as relating to something other than just my priorities, that's the beginning of wisdom. Now, in political and international affairs, naturally enough, we begin from that self-oriented perspective. How does this affect me? How does this serve me in my needs? What if we were capable a little bit more of saying, well, let's look at another country, another person, in their own terms. Let's listen a bit and learn something of their own language and see what their priorities and their concerns are. And it may be that we will find in the long run that serving and identifying with those needs gives us more security or more stability than simply trying to impose our own agenda.
See, this is a point to both of you. In these circumstances of mass political violence, dispossession, we're tempted to see, one side, or look, put it this way: people see the terrorist as either the devil, as either the incarnation of all evil, or they see the terrorist as someone divinely ordained in their behaviour. So they see the terrorist diabolically or angelically. The toughest thing, surely, is seeing the terrorist humanly, seeing the terrorist as someone who might be us in a certain circumstance.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it a little bit in the book. There's a film which I'd recommend actually called Paradise Now, which is about two Palestinian suicide bombers, and you realise the context in which they're coming from, and they are very human. They're doing it as an act, in that sense, for a particular conviction. It doesn't necessarily make it right, but you come to understand, they come from families, loving families, but they come from destitution as well. So it's trying to understand. I think that's the point Rowan's making too. It's trying to understand the context in which this violence emerges, and I think that's where justice has a role, and that's where love has a role. Love, I think it's redefining the term, making it bigger, broader. And I think also Rowan said something about it, turning the other cheek is not a passive act. It's actually an act of action, in a sense. It's about taking a movement. And because I always found that really fascinating when we were talking too. Your thought on that,
yes.
that notion of its action?
Yes, it's a very challenging idea. I think that turning the other cheek is not simply accepting violence. It's a kind of refusal, an active refusal to collude with violence. It's saying, I'm not going to play that game. Let's change the terms of this encounter. Now, that may or may not work for people. It's certainly something that people have to sense as a real personal challenge and calling. But I think it is extremely important to get across the idea that peacemaking is itself active, not passive, not just the cancelling of violence, but the active engagement with the reality that's there. And going back to what you were saying about the terrorist, I think the other film that I mentioned in the conversation was the British film Four Lions, about four very vulnerable, muddled and confused Muslims in Britain who get sucked into a terror cell. And they're hapless and confused, and it doesn't in the least justify or make sense, moral sense, of what they get involved in. But you begin to see them also as victims in this. And when you begin to see the other person as, in some sense, a victim, not just someone who's, if you like, the source of meaningless, barbaric behavior, you begin to see something of the humanity. Not condoning, let's say it again, not softening the evil, the appalling evil of terror, but to say some of those caught up in it are precisely caught up. They're sucked in, they're vulnerable, they're exploited by others. And yeah, that's part of the difficult recognition of.
Let's move on now, and because we don't have a great deal of time left. I want to talk about nationalism and tribalism because, boy, if there's two phenomena that have convulsed the world in the past 5 or 6 years, it's been those two. Rowan, you have this wonderful line about the notion of identity, and you say that the good identity is one that enriches the stranger. What do you mean by that?
If I feel that I'm deeply rooted in who I am and where I am, grateful for, conscious of a tradition which I want to share for the well-being, the flourishing, the enlargement of someone else, I think that's a healthy way of inhabiting a tradition, an identity, a nationality, whatever. If I approach my relations with others always thinking the other's very presence is a threat to who I am, then I end up building thicker and thicker walls around my own identity, so that identity actually shrinks. It becomes less secure, less real, less deep. And what takes up the space is the wall. So that's the difference I'm trying to get at.
Mary, enriching the stranger with your own identity, how would you achieve that?
I think this is part of the religious tradition, and I think it's part of something. I think that Jesus or the Christian tradition is, inviting the stranger in to your house. Actually having come in, have some food, come and share with me, because it's actually what we've lost is that sense of the stranger, that it's a real welcome. It's not. And it's in that welcome or in that hospitality, even though there's a lot of argument around the difficulty of hospitality because of who's being the host, so on and so forth. But I still think there's something very rich in, welcoming, in actually the stranger coming into your house in that sense.
But I'm not saying this is a legitimate feeling, but it's an understandable feeling. A lot of people think the stranger is there to do them harm.
Well, yeah, that's I think the common sort of myth, right? And I think that's also to do.
I mean, if you're a German woman in Berlin and someone sets off a bomb in or has a terrorist attack in a Christmas market,
I was there actually, and one of the most interesting things I found was that the whole wall where that had happened, everybody had the need for peace, the need for love. At that moment, the response was that. We do not want to have more violence. We do not want more of this. And the letters that were on the walls, I mean, it was just something to actually behold in that sense. But yeah, of course, there's that anger. There's anger there. But to dismiss, to even open up the possibility of sharing, to break down those barriers, those borders are crucial. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's...
On a more benign level, in your country, Rowan, the notion of identity became very complex during the Brexit debate and subsequent, because a lot of people there simply didn't think they had the same identity. Not just talking about ethnic identity or religious identity, they simply didn't think they had the same national identity as their neighbours, did they?
You're quite right. That was one of the deepest issues in the Brexit debate, that suddenly we discovered how divided we were as a country, how much great swathes of the country felt they'd been abandoned, neglected by a powerful elite. And although I voted against Brexit myself, I feel there's an ongoing and still unfinished agenda around how we reconnect deprived, threatened, and declining communities with the practice of government and with, again, a just society in the broadest sense that allows people to feel they have a say, they have a presence. It's, of course, reflected in a growing interest in regional power, regional hubs, talking about how the large cities of the north acquire more self-determining powers. It's reflected in, of course, very dramatically, the growth of Scottish separatism, even in Wales, where I'm now living in retirement.
Oh, you're not going to split off. Please don't tell us that.
Well, watch this space. I doubt it. But there's certainly a resurgence of Welsh nationalism here. And all of that reflects the sense that we have a governing elite that is not plugged in to the needs and concerns of local communities. Now, if you have certain kinds of political leadership, most obviously Donald Trump in the United States, you can exploit and weaponize that sense of alienation in the most dramatic and indeed toxic ways possible. But if you're going to avoid that exploitation, then you need to do some very hard work about how governing groups are more deeply connected with the decision-making of local communities. You have also to foster the decision-making structures that are available in local communities and make sure that they're embedded in one another, they lock together. And there's a lot to be done there, I think, in renewing democracy.
Mary, just as we wind up, the other thing that sort of hangs over this book, as you put it together last year, is, of course, the pandemic. There's a lot in your book about the idea of the commodification of the person by economic systems. I want you to answer a question that Rowan poses, because I think it's so appropriate to the pandemic and all the sacrifice that it has entailed. Who's lost their jobs, whose business, whose little corner store has gone out of business while everyone migrates their money to platforms like Amazon. Rowan poses this question: who pays the most when things are difficult? Who has paid the most in this pandemic?
Well, yeah, I think everyone has in different ways.
Really? I mean, some people have been enriched by the pandemic.
The everyday person, perhaps, is probably a better way of putting it. I mean, I'm thinking more about, walking down the street. I mean, even today, I go to a chemist to, pick up certain things, and the guy that's owned the chemist has just left now because he can't afford, because of the pandemic, So the chemist is gutted. And I guess for me, it was sort of like these everyday things that you expect to be the same or have changed. And it's often to do with, the sort of inability to keep up. And I guess when I say the everyday person, I guess I mean that for a lot of us at the moment, we don't know what's going to happen. We still don't know how this is unfolding. But we do have a lot of grief, I think, a lot of us in different ways, whatever that might be. And I think a lot of people, I think it gets more complex for people also who have never really handled society that well anyway. And so all of a sudden you have these measures about distancing or not being able to see people. And so the despair, I think, is hitting the everyday person in that sense. So I think, a lot of people can exploit it. I think Yanis Varoufakis said something really wonderful that, Amazon has become like the new Red Cross or something, but actually it's making a lot of money out of people, right? So it's the shifting parameters of what we view as, I guess, kind of value and worth, has moved more towards, the commodity or the commodification of things. But the real value, I think, is in the recognition of our everyday experience, which I think, this is where I think love and justice kind of come into play, that recognition.
Yeah, final question before we take some questions from the audience. Rowan, answer your own question. Who pays the most when things get difficult?
One of the things we've learned in the last year, I think, is that there is what I'd call a front line here. Care workers, people with vulnerable mental health conditions, minority ethnic communities, all of these seem to be disproportionately carrying the load. And just to to become aware that there is a front line here. There is a category in society of people who will be the first to suffer. That's an important recognition, because if that's the case, we need to make sure that the protections and support are there for those who are on that front line. Whether it's care workers, health workers, people with mental health conditions, people in minority ethnic communities, and so on. So that's one thing I hope we may have learned about, because those seem to be where the burdens really land. But Mary's also importantly said, we've discovered that in certain circumstances, we're all prepared to pay a certain price for collective safety, collective health, that we're not perhaps as selfish as some might have feared.
Let's use the last 5 or 6 minutes to take some questions. Do we have any questions? We don't have any questions from the audience. Well, let's pick up a couple more of those very thoughtful questions that were sent to us earlier. Kevin O'Sullivan, vitriol is the new language of division, especially via online social communication. What is the antidote to return to more life-giving and respectful dialogue as we listen deeply to one another despite our differences? Mary.
Yeah, that's also a very big question.
Well, and it's the question for our time, really.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that we've been trying to investigate too is how to give meaning back to words, to what you say, in a sense, how you say it, that there's an integrity or a dignity given and an understanding given. I think the problem perhaps with, the good thing about social media in the sense is that it can actually circulate information and people can get it sort of instantly. I think the problem is that we don't spend enough time really taking time to hear, to listen, to take time, to be patient and to care for that interaction. So the speed of things, I think if there's one also key thing that we discussed is time. The need for attention and time, like taking time. Time has probably been the biggest exploiter in the last 20 years, I think. And I think social media kind of accelerates that. But then it is also a platform for ideas. So, it's a balance. But I think bringing time back into the equation, taking time before you spit something out is probably a good thing.
Rowan, this is from Saba Shah. What are the practical things that I can do to bring more love and justice to the world, to those who need it most?
Start locally, I think. Look at the community you're in and ask, who are the people likeliest to feel forgotten here? What would make those people feel less forgotten? And that may be a category of people, it may be a community, it may be a particular neighbour, it may be a member of your own family. But that's, I think, where you start. Just look around and step back enough to see, so who is not actually represented, audible, visible here? And what can I do to include their voice, their perspective? And on top of that, I think, picking up what Mary's just said, maybe look at your own daily rhythm and your own pattern of life and say, how do I give myself time to breathe and to be free from the hectic, feverish need to get my presence, my views, etc., out there and order with everybody? How do I step back from myself and breathe and be and see a bit more clearly?
That's a wonderful place to end, Rowan, and a terrific question from Saba to end on. It's been a terrific hour with all of you here. I just want to now recommend this marvellous book, Justice and Love, a philosophical dialogue, Mary Zounazi and Rowan Williams. And I want to thank Mary and Rowan. It's been a challenge on a difficult Zoom line for Rowan but it's been a pleasure to have you, Rowan. Mary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the UNSW Centre for Ideas. It is the incubator of so many great public discussions in this city and this country. I want to thank them for the work that they've done, again, under very difficult circumstances in putting this together. Thank you to those of you who've been able to be here, and thank you to the many hundreds of you who've been joining us online. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone.